I am Lorraine Nowlin, member of the Board of Directors and facilitator of the Black Women's Caucus of WDI USA. Welcome to our webinar, How the Trans Lobby Co-opted the Struggle for Black American Civil Rights and How Radical Feminists of all races can work together to dispel this forced teaming. Are you as appalled as I am when you hear it's not about bathrooms like it wasn't about water fountains? Or what about women-only bathrooms or like white-only bathrooms? One could force legitimacy to their movement by making such insensitive comparisons. For argument's sake, let's say they are right, that it wasn't about water fountains. It was about the right to vote, the right not to be banished to the back of the bus because you are Black, the right not to be disenfranchised in all areas of life due to not because of anything that we did or because of what pronoun we wanted, but for our skin color. For you, it's not about bathrooms. It's abundantly clear that the goal is adult male access to the spaces designed for women and girls where we are vulnerable. For a man to be legally recognized as a woman, and unlike the Black civil rights movement, to impose a new identity upon everyone else, like cis woman or cis man, or my favorite, cis Hess. If they can successfully brand those fighting for civil rights as racist, they will win. To hear anyone, whether government officials, activists, medical professionals, religious leaders, anyone make such a comparison is an act of betrayal. Slide 2. As you look at these images of Black civil rights protesters arrested, slide 3, and sprayed with a water hose, I want you to ask yourself what they are fighting for. Slide 4. Can you honestly look at these individuals invading the women's bathroom and compare them to a Black teen civil rights protester wanting to be treated like a human being? If your answer is yes, the anti-Black racist is you. I guarantee that at least 4 of those individuals in the bathroom would have had white racial privilege in the early 1900s and enduring Jim Crow than the Black people they are comparing themselves to. But we are to believe the struggles is the same. We cannot allow gender identity activists to use Black civil rights to destroy the rights of women and girls of all races, because make no mistake, these comparisons will impact us all. That's why we have a fierce lineup of women to shed more light on this important issue. We have Kara Dansky, who is the former president of the Board of Directors of WDI USA and the author of The Reckoning, How the Democrats and the Left Betrayed Women and Girls. We have Irene Lawrence. She is the board secretary and member of the volunteer coordination team and the coordinator of public actions. Lauren Levey. She is also a board member, coordinator of the Lesbian Caucus, coordinator of the state legislative advocacy team, and coordinator of the Lesbian Bill of Rights International. We also have Aja Lyons. She's a writer, historian, and a teacher. And last, but certainly not least, we have Dr. Suzanne Vierling. First, Kara Dansky.
Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you to everyone who's here, and thank you to all the panelists for this important discussion. My parents were and are staunch Democrats. They were both born in the late 1940s and came of age in the 1950s and 1960s. Born and raised in Miami, Florida, my father experienced Jim Crow segregation firsthand as a child as a white Jewish boy. As a city planner and civil engineer in Miami Beach, my father's father, my grandfather, actively participated in enforcing Jim Crow segregation through legal means. My mother's parents, children of Irish and German immigrants, were openly racist against Black people and immigrants of any color that wasn't white. As young adults in the 1960s, my parents rejected their parents' hostility toward Black people and supported the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed racial segregation in places of public accommodation for the first time in federal law. They raised me to have a very positive attitude toward the movement for Black liberation. They made sure I knew all about Dr. King. When Julian Bond, who founded the Southern Poverty Law Center in Alabama in 1971, came to speak in my small hometown in southeastern Ohio, they made sure I attended. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a crowning achievement of the civil rights movement in ending Jim Crow segregation. When I reflect on the topic we're here to discuss today, I often think about how, to me, it is utterly unimaginable to have racial segregation in places of public accommodation. I think I've been to all 50 states, and I lived in the District of Columbia for over 10 years. I have been in public women's bathrooms and locker rooms with women of all colors and all types of appearances. I've never seen a whites only sign on a bathroom door. I have, however, seen an all genders sign on a bathroom door, and it makes me physically ill. There's a federal bill called the Equality Act. It was first introduced in Congress in 2015 and was reintroduced in every session of Congress through 2023. The bill would amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the crowning achievement of the civil rights movement, to redefine sex to include so-called gender identity for all purposes, including places of public accommodation. It would render all public female-only spaces effectively mixed sex. The bill passed in the House of Representatives in 2019 and again in 2021. It has never gone to a vote in the Senate. The last time it was introduced in Congress was in 2023, and it went nowhere. Happily, it has not been introduced in 2025 and appears to be dead. In my view, WDI USA deserves a tremendous amount of credit for the death of this hideous and racist bill. The forced teaming of trans with the movement to end racial segregation happens all the time. Literally this morning, I came across a post on X or Twitter referring to J.K. Rowling and directed at a radical feminist that said, quote, "If instead of a gender segregated space, she would demand a race segregated space, would that be okay for you?" Implying that single sex spaces are the same as racially segregated ones. There's even a Facebook group called Being Racist to Own the TERFs, where members, who are all radical feminists and allies, provide examples, countless examples of gender zealots going out of their way to be openly racist as a way of criticizing the radical feminists who care about female-only spaces. There are countless examples in that group of white people comparing Black women to men and analogizing single-sex spaces to racial segregation. For our purposes today, I just want to make the main point that the so-called Equality Act is a perfect example of how trans co-ops the struggle for Black American civil rights. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was literally the legal mechanism through which America ended racial segregation in places of public accommodation, including bathrooms, locker rooms, changing rooms, and the like. The so-called Equality Act would steal that accomplishment from the movement for Black liberation to satisfy the sexual demands of mostly white men to terrorize women and girls of all races. I'm glad the bill is gone for now, but radical feminists of all races must remain vigilant in our work to dispel this forced teaming and to keep men out of spaces meant for women and girls. This matters for the rights, privacy, safety, and dignity of women and girls of all races. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kara. Aja Lyons.
Yes, well, thank you all, panelists, you wonderful women, and those who are listening and in the chat. So my name is Aja Lyons. Both of my parents are Black. My mama's Black, my daddy's Black, and all of their parents are Black. My grandmother was born in 1941. She attended segregated schools her entire life, from primary school to university. My mother was born in 1964, same year as the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that outlawed discrimination based on race, sex, color, religion, national origin, that prohibited discrimination, segregation in schools, public accommodations, and employment discrimination. My grandmother spent her entire life working as a maid, waitress, and janitor. My mother became an English teacher. I am now earning a PhD. This occurred because discriminatory barriers over time have lessened. Men, however, particularly white men, have nearly always had access to opportunities. Conflating race, which is phenotype, genotype, hereditary traits, of which that are primarily observable, with gender, sex stereotypes, which are entirely socially constructed and shift over time and shift by region, are inaccurate and harmful. And I want to get into the history, because I am a historian, into the history of aspects of what the impetus for the Civil Rights Act. This unfortunately is not as commonly known, while many African Americans, particularly those in the South, which my family, generations in Texas, I can trace my ancestors all the way back to rural East Texas, where they were enslaved. The sexual violence against Black women was the primary impetus for things starting to change. A good read, for those who are interested, I will always shout out a woman's work, At the Dark End of the Street, Black Women, Rape and Resistance, A New History of the Civil Rights Movement, From Rosa Parks to the Rise of Black Power, by Danielle L. McGuire. Fabulous reading. So, look at the bus boycott. Who was primarily taking the bus? Black women who worked as maids in white neighborhoods. When we look at rural areas, who is walking on foot to get from house to house, home to home, field to field? Primarily Black women. That was the impetus for the creation and fight for laws to ban discrimination, because Black women were the most vulnerable and Black women were the ones getting raped, getting assaulted. And finally, people said enough. And so the backbone of this work has always been, due in part primarily to Black women, and because of what was happening to Black women. It is not as easy for a woman to fight back against a man, which is why there should be legal protections for women, all women against men, all men, regardless of their sartorial choices. And so another aspect that I really want to focus on before I start to wrap things up is that how degrading gender ideology is to the material reality of Black female oppression. So Black women were and are remain the economic foundation of the USA. If we look at who are the healthcare workers, who are the primarily fast food workers, restaurant workers, women taking care of children, Black women taking care of children, Black and brown women taking care of children. And so with the populace that was growing during times of slavery, the 1807 Act prohibiting the importation of slaves was enacted to sort of slow down the population. Well, the international slave trade from Europe, Latin America, and such to the USA then became one of the domestic slave trades. So state to state, county to county. That then placed a demand on Black women to be broodmare. There were some plantations that were solely for Black women reproducing. And so not only were these women, but also their babies were used as currency and even interest. And last but not least, we are all women here, the number of men who have profited from the exploitation of the Black female body has been completely unwarranted. Deemed the father of modern gynecology, I hate to say Dr. J. Marion Sims, became known as the father of modern gynecology around the world because of his developments and innovations that were based off of the experimentation on the Black female body, as well as the murder of children, Black children who were born with disabilities and certain conditions that are now handled differently, thankfully. He experimented on them as well, and this led to often murder. Enslaved women were also forced to act as his nurses. None of these women who were needlessly murdered while being used as test subjects have been acknowledged as the mothers of gynecology. And so when I think about or take into consider gender ideology and how this belief that if someone thinks or feels a certain way, this is something to be acknowledged, disrespects the memory of these women and of these children who did not get to identify their way out of their material reality. If that was any ounce of truth to any of this, those who faced these horrific brutalities would have made that choice.
Thank you, Aja. Lauren Levey.
Hi. So being accused of racism as a TERF is confusing for me. The first challenge I'm faced with is to figure out what race the accuser thinks I am. This is because the white people who care the most about who's white and who's not don't consider me to be white because I'm ethnically a Jew. And they have a point. While there are Jews whose ancestors spent centuries of exile from the Jewish homeland in Africa or in the Middle East, and whose skin is darker than mine, my ancestors spent that time in Europe. I am a European or Ashkenazi Jew, meaning that by DNA, I'm still about 55% Middle Eastern and 45% European, French and German in my case. American white nationalists call Jews one of the muddy races. So that's what I am to the far right. They do not claim me as white or as one of them. I have white privilege only until my Jewishness is discovered, and I make a point of never disguising it. On the other hand, what Jews get from a lot of so-called progressives is that Jews are not only white, but sort of extra white and extra oppressive. For instance, as the illegitimate white American colonizers of Arab land in the Middle East. It's not only that some Jews have lightish skin, but we are reputed to have additional white privileges, such as extra wealth, extra education, and extra antisocial tendencies. So besides killing Jesus, I'm probably also a slumlord or an embezzler, or at best, a capitalist stealing the value of poor people's honest labor. It's presumed that as a Jew, I don't make an honest living in a trade. Never mind that for many hundreds of years, all European Jews were excluded from participation in any trade. So all of this is to explain why I feel pretty much racially homeless to begin with. Neither right nor left, neither white nor non-white wants to claim me as one of their own. Jews are Schrodinger's people. I had close European relatives whom I knew personally who had survived the Holocaust. They told me their horrifying stories of how they just barely survived and how they still had nightmares and other trauma effects decades later. Against that background, being framed as not only grossly white, but also specifically as a Nazi feels particularly cruel. As a Jew, I've always felt an affinity with Black women. So much of their oppression and so much of their adaptations to oppression have felt familiar to me. For example, I have discussed with Black women how disappointing Jewish men can be. I want my men to be the best men, right? But the reality is they just aren't always the best. Whenever a Jewish man is convicted of embezzlement or tax fraud or sex trafficking, I cringe. The failings of Jewish men should not reflect on me, but of course they do, because that's how racism and sexism work, especially when they intersect. I have been told by some Black women that they sometimes have similar feelings about Black men. You just wish your men would avoid the worst of the stereotypes, and they so often fail even to do that. Meanwhile, historical revisionists claim that white feminism historically excluded not only deserving drag queens, but also Black women. But I personally remember that the creators of the second wave of the women's liberation movement were overwhelmingly Jewish women, such as Dworkin and Firestone, and Black women, such as Audre Lorde and Flo Kennedy. As a young faculty member and chair of the Dartmouth Women's Caucus in 1976, I personally brought Flo Kennedy to Dartmouth College to make a presentation. Her radical feminist perspective was brilliant, and it was brilliant in part because of her Black woman's perspective. So yeah, my baseline is alienation from white people on both right and left. But the accusation of being anti-Black drives a wedge between me and Black women, with whom Jews should be natural allies. And then to be called a Nazi in addition, right? So here we are, thanks to Lorraine.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Dr. Vierling.
Hello, everyone. Wonderful to be here with the crew, all of us, from all over the United States, I'm sure, and hopefully some of us from around the world. One of the things that I wanted to do was to give a little history of Trojan horse and forest teaming. It'll be the quickest history of Black women ever. So let's go. Let's get right into it. Next slide. Okay, you know, one of the things that I think a lot of women have been shocked to see, just the blatant use of Black women in using Black women to Trojan horse in the erasure of women, the commodification of women, and just totally justify basically white men and non-white men in, but we know it's been, you know, powerful white men that have pushed their way through and using the Black woman as part of forced teaming themselves somehow into womanhood. But it's not new, and it's been a long-standing use of the Black woman. And so here I have a picture of Ruby Bridges from Brown versus Education, Integration, this poor little Black girl put out front on the front lines, this little tiny little, turned her into a warrior. So this is the birth of the, second wave of the strong Black woman. It started in slavery, but this was a reiteration. And as you can see, this image of the little girl is replayed again by the prominent featuring of the little girl down below during Black Lives Matter heyday, I believe in 2020. And then all of these images came out during Black Lives Matter, cover of the Rolling Stone, the cover of Time, multiple images of these, poor, struggling Black women holding their sons and their disappearing sons, because of course the thing at the time, okay, the police is killing Black boys, et cetera, et cetera. That was the narrative. But the Black woman was put out front. But the reality is, behind the scenes, what was Trojan horsed in was an incredible amount of money coming from everywhere and going to everybody in Black Lives Matter. To this day, most people cannot account. We know some of the leadership bought some houses and hooked up their boyfriends and stuff, but there were an incredible amount of money. I think it was hundreds of millions of dollars that was collected for Black Lives Matter. So money was moving in the background. And then you have, so now we see that while what is presented to us in the front, there's a whole bunch of money being moved in the back. Okay, next slide. Okay, so a lot of us weren't even born in the 70s. I lived through the 70s. And during civil rights, post Brown versus Education and moving into civil rights, where what Kara was referring to, there was a powerful bombardment of Black women imagery from the 70s, well through the 80s, into the 90s and to today. You have the booming, what was called Blaxploitation television. So there was a booming industry of films that showed Black women and Black men as, undercover cops, undercover prostitutes, pimps, undercover cops playing pimps, et cetera, et cetera. And it was in heavy rotation, this over-sexualized imagery of Black women on film. And there was a booming industry, and these films went all over the world. At the same time, there was the war on drugs. You had drugs being brought into the United States and into poor communities. And, it really impacted, poor neighborhoods, poor people. We had booming gangs, and we had, people that were addicted to crack cocaine. And we had these images of the Black woman with her children alone in some projects. And it was regular heavy rotation on 2020, 60 Minutes, Dateline. Dateline looked different than the way it does now. And it was just in heavy rotation, okay? Then there was also in heavy rotation, the welfare queen, the Black woman that just has 1 million children and she's getting checks from everywhere and she's doing welfare fraud and all of that. So again, simultaneously with these Black exploitation films, television shows on the war on drugs, addicted women being interviewed by these posh, lean, interviewers, journalists, the image of the welfare queen, and then all of the babies that came from addicted mothers. And so there was just this air of fascination and revulsion for the Black woman post-civil rights, okay? What came from that was, again, a booming media image where the Black person became, the Black body became a source of fascination and revulsion on film. The war on drugs was a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it involved the Iran-Contra, all this like international global warfare and various issues. Welfare reform, which moved a lot of money that people didn't know was being moved behind the scenes, including the privatization of foster care and social services. Next slide. Okay, and the Trojan horse was we onboarded the privatization of foster care. It's still to this day a multi-billion-dollar industry, and soon to grow if gender-affirming care continues unabated. It will be folded into the current foster care system, and it onboarded all of this. All of our attention is on the Black woman in the 70s, 80s, but behind it, mental health and psychiatry completely changed, where before a therapist could have a nice therapy session and write up their notes and maybe write a book, or maybe be teaching at the university, but it became an industry, it became a business. ADHD medication, antidepressants, anxiolytics, psychiatry became this billable every 15 minutes thing, and therapy went from 3 hours with a psychoanalytic therapeutic intervention style to a 60-minute hour. And that went to a 50-minute hour, and then that went to a 45-minute hour. And then that boomed. And children, you could just see Black children as far as the eye can see in any facility that you stepped into. Next slide. I think this might be I have very little time. Okay, and then we see that how many Black women were deployed to go after Trump. And so, half of the United States, or a little bit more, very upset with these Black women. I'm sure people, Fannie Willis and company, and many of these women didn't know that each other were deployed to go after Trump. And we already know that there are many men behind the scenes. Bob, Bill, Tom, Jedediah were behind the scenes to get to go after and try and push Trump out of the way, but Black women were the face and took the revulsion. Last slide. Okay, I'll just really quickly, this is Claudine Gay, and she became the face of DEI. Everybody went after her, plundered her, and she was on a board that did, her face was out there to save DEI, to save all sorts of things, and her board let her stay out there and get hung out to dry. Next slide. And this is the forced team consequences that we all know of today. They said, well, Serena Williams, she was like the symbol. If she can be allowed into womanhood, and they tried to put it on women, that somehow white women were stopping Black women from being a part of womanhood. They tried to do that shift so that a man like this basketball player on a young girls team can go into womanhood. The consequences, we still have women incarcerated at the state level with men. And I think that is my final.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vierling. Irene Lawrence.
Hi, good evening. Sorry, I was in the car for a while there. I wanted to focus on an incident that happened at the Olympics last year, kind of go off of that. I was horrified but not surprised to see the ire that I received after I posted to Facebook a statement by Black artist and writer Nowlin after Iman Khalif beat up Angela Carini in boxing at the 2024 Paris Olympics. Her article is titled, "Stop Co-opting Black Female Oppression to Elevate Trans Women Athletes." Her article stated, "This is the most glaring example of how trans rights activists piggyback on the struggles of historically marginalized groups in order to boost their own agenda. In this case, that group is Black women." Her perspective in this article seemed spot on, And I naively thought that the fact that a Black woman was saying these things might make my Facebook audience more receptive to these viewpoints. Instead, I was read the riot act for expecting Black women to conform to white female beauty standards. We couldn't even have any coherent discussion about the racism described in the article about Black women, specifically Black female athletes, being deemed manly looking. Because suddenly I was a bully for attacking this poor Black woman who was really a man with a disordered sexual development. And meanwhile, the white female boxer was seemingly unworthy of any dignity or sympathy. These friends who were suddenly angry with me were all white women who had known me for years, if not decades, and they knew my values intimately. In response to their accusations, I posted nuanced explanations by reproductive biologists with knowledge of DSDs, explaining the likely trajectory of Khalif's development and how and why such men get recruited for female sports. But it seemed easier for my friends to believe that I had suddenly become a different person who no longer cared about racial oppression than to believe that my views were even worthy of consideration. There was a lot of virtue signaling going on in this online fight, but there were a lot of other dynamics going on too that I want to examine. For one thing, Nowlin's perspective isn't shared among all Black women, the author of this article. I can understand why Black women who are not radical feminists, especially, might be inclined to sympathize with Khalif over Karini due to frequent political pressures that Black women experience to choose between their race and their sex, and due to patriarchy's tendency to keep women from politicizing our struggles or seeing them as aligned. Plus, white women have sometimes historically weaponized this trope of Black men as predatory and hypersexual to falsely accuse them, leading Black women to feel little sympathy for white women in such situations. An infamous example of this is Carolyn Bryant, a white woman whose accusations against 14-year-old Emmett Till led to his lynching in 1955. She died in 2023 at age 88, having admitted in 2007 that her accusations about Till's advances were a lie. She never suffered any consequences for her role in his murder. Suffice it to say, many Black women are highly reluctant to align with white women, especially when white women's alliances are primarily with white men. Another general dynamic I've noticed is that white women seem to be getting increasingly silenced, but the nature of the silencing tends to differ from what Black women get, from what I've seen. It seems like around 10 years ago, putting white before the word woman became a way to discredit something that woman said, even if the issue at hand wasn't about race at all, and even if what she was saying was sensible. Meanwhile, Black women's voices have never stopped being discounted in other ways. I see them often being accused of being angry and loud when they express justifiable outrage or insist on respect. The different types of silencing that Black and white women experience almost guarantees that even when those women who believe in working for our collective liberation don't have an easy time learning from each other. In all female spaces, I often see white women finally feeling free to speak their minds against gender ideology can unintentionally talk over Black women and or speak as if all women's experiences are the same. I've noticed that Black women can sometimes be hesitant to speak about their experiences specifically as Black women. And there are, unfortunately, usually few enough women of color in radical feminist spaces that I can see how those who are there can feel the burden of speaking for their racial group. So how should we begin disrupting this concerted silencing of women of all races, starting with our own radical feminist spaces? I have a few ideas for places to start. Let's start from the assumption that we can handle hearing about each other's experiences. Patriarchy often hampers our judgment so much that we think our struggles are unique to us, or only unique to women in our racial group, or that our sisters won't be able to handle the entirety of our struggles. And this keeps us estranged from each other. Additionally, women should never have to leave their culture at the door when they enter radical feminist spaces. Unlike sex, race is actually a spectrum, and the combination of cultural influences each of us comes in with is unique to us. Being radical feminist never means becoming less Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, etc. And finally, I think we need to stop using race to amplify or discredit a woman's voice. A perspective or argument is not more or less valid because someone of a certain race said it. Each argument needs to be taken on its own merits. A woman who is brilliant on one topic may be woefully misguided in another. We shouldn't tolerate racial animosity between ourselves, but women are all human. And if we're going to allow each other to have full humanity, we need to allow each other to learn and grow from whichever point that we're starting from.
Thank you so much, Irene. And yes, this forced teaming that they're doing is meant to silence both Black women and white women. Thank you so much. We're going to go into a panelist question, but if you in the audience, if you have a question or a comment, please put it in the QA and we will get to it as soon as we can after the panelist QA. Speaking of being racist to own the turfs, take a look at this. A woman, a Black woman on X, formerly known as Twitter, was basically, speaking her mind about, the censorship. And, she's quote unquote gender critical. In other words, she believes in the reality of sex and she is a Black woman. And look at the response from a quote trans rights activist, the Be Kind crowd. He basically calls her the N-word. I've seen so much of that online. It's like they're using this as an excuse to just enact their racism. Let's see, next slide. And we also see how, the forced teaming in various media, anti-trans bathroom bills, inviting Jim Crow comparisons, such a betrayal. Next slide. I believe there's one or two more. Again, this comparison, because we couldn't use a certain bathroom because of the color of their skin, but now we have people who want to use a bathroom that they want because they want to be the opposite sex. Okay, let's get into this. First question. Have you ever personally experienced your views being compared to Jim Crow, or have you witnessed other feminists being accused of this? Please share that experience. Kara, would you like to go first?
I'm happy to, and of course I have experienced that, but rather than talking about my own experience, I think I'd like to share a little bit about a story that I heard from a friend who's like, she's a very old, good friend. She's white. I've known her since third grade. She's on the very outskirts of just learning about so-called gender identity and the threats that it poses to women and girls. And she has late age teenage daughters. And I've waded into conversations with her about this kind of stuff in Facebook DMs, and she's basically on our side, but she's not a full-on TERF yet. But she told me one time that when she talks about the importance of female-only spaces, her teenage daughters call her racist. And that was very confusing to her. She just didn't understand. And it was also very difficult for her because she was raised by very conservative, not very conservative, but sort of middle of the road 1980s conservative white parents. And she got called racist because her parents, or maybe she didn't, but her parents got called racist frequently in the 1980s. And I think accurately for all of the reasons Suzanne was describing. Depictions, the reality of the war on drugs, depictions of the welfare queen, and her parents bought into all of that. And later in life as an adult, she rejected all of that and she became a staunch Democrat. And she considered herself a good liberal and she thought she was doing the right thing. So she was just very taken aback and surprised and didn't know how to handle it when her teenage white daughters called her a racist because she doesn't want men in women's bathrooms. So that's not an experience of myself or another radical feminist. It's an experience of a normie lefty woman who is just struggling to navigate these conversations.
Aja, is there anything you would like to add? Have you ever experienced or witnessed this happening?
Oh my goodness. Thankfully, no. I don't think anyone would be so bold as to call, me racist, at least not to my face. But I'd like to see them try. I would welcome that engagement, that debate. But no, I have had people call me a fascist. I think many white liberals infantilize Black women, and so they just think, oh, she just doesn't know any better. She hasn't figured it out yet. She'll get there. She hasn't evolved, or oh, she's so old school. Because for instance, I oppose using the term queer. I grew up in Texas. I moved out of state, and I was told, this was in 2013. I heard all there was in Texas were queers and steers. And so I don't use the term queer. If I'm talking about gay men, I say gay men. If I'm talking about lesbians, I say lesbians. And so I've spoken about, my opposition to using the term queer. And I've been told, that's due to my age. So I think people attribute my perspective to either me being fascist, just oppressing these poor trans people, or they, see me as old and outdated and decrepit.
Thank you. Lauren.
Old and outdated indeed. I've been accused of being simultaneously racist and transphobic on both Facebook and X Twitter. One accuser included a diagram purportedly representing about a dozen different women's body types. So there was a drawing of a fat woman, an old woman, a muscular woman, a Black woman, an Asian woman, a woman wearing a burqa, and so forth, and a man. This diagram was offered as proof that all of those differences in body types have equal significance and that all are types of female bodies, and that if you exclude one of them, you may as well exclude all of them because you're a bigot either way. But it seems obvious to me that there is no violation of women's safety, privacy, or dignity when a woman shares, say, a public bathroom with women having different physical appearances. On the other hand, the presence of a man, with or without a penis, does pose a significant challenge to women's safety, privacy, and dignity. Thanks.
Absolutely. Dr. Vierling.
Well, just have to just say this. I have been called a Karen, and I tell you, the first time I was called Karen, it knocked me out. I couldn't breathe. And I said, I'm not going to let that happen again. I'm going to be ready the next time. I said, oh my God. And one of the most powerful things that has happened, look, Karen, don't laugh, because if you laugh, I'm going to laugh. Powerful men have been able to legally create a minority, the most oppressed minority group. They have managed to wedge that under, poor women, Black and brown women. I mean, they're like, we're the most oppressed, and they have the most power. So they're able to say, you discriminated against me above and beyond the level of racism, because sexism, they don't care because they're sexist. And they have the power to have the laws in place, have the judges in the pocket. And so they can punish you, us, everybody, on both ends. I'm the most privileged, and by the way, you have oppressed me, and it's quite genius, really. If we weren't so negatively affected, it's quite genius to be able to create that. And they got that from forced teaming on, interestingly enough, Black men, by saying, the Black trans woman is murdered, or the murder rate is, and create all of this hysteria. And they just keep, that tape just kept playing and playing and playing to the point that it's almost like they took melanin and rubbed it on themselves. You don't hear them talk about it so much anymore. But remember, years ago, boy, every day was the Black trans woman, the Black trans woman. And today they've successfully, now have everybody's minds thinking that they're the most oppressed, regardless of their ethnicity. So hope I answered your question, but yes, honey. When you get you Black and you get called a Karen, honey.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know that I have too much to add. I feel like the incidents, it often comes up in terms of like what Lauren was saying about body types, like anyone who has any sort of, like, anyone who correctly points out a man's sex is always accused of like, well, a woman can have any kind of body type, and Never mind the fact that like even a skinny man still clearly has the musculature and is still a threat to women. So it always gets framed as a conversation about body types rather than sex reality.
Right, absolutely. Very, very quickly, the only thing I can remember is when at the San Francisco convention with all of the men, the trans rights activists, in addition to telling us to jump off the balcony, I'm there and I'm visible and they're yelling KKK, KKK, and I'm thinking, am I invisible? Or are they really, trying to trigger me or something? But anyway, so audience, if anybody else has a question, in order for us to distinguish, please put your question in the Q&A. Thank you very much. So the next question. Why a lot of Black women and white women seem to jump on this forced teaming bandwagon? Why do you think that both groups of women are susceptible to, this is like racism? Why? Why do you think we're susceptible to that? Kara?
It sort of feels like this is a similar question to the question of why do so many women go along with so-called gender identity? Is that fair?
Yes. Yeah. Why? Yes. Why are they susceptible to going along with it? If you could think.
Yeah, I mean, I really feel like in our convention in Atlanta, a former board member named Carla gave a really interesting talk, which was very controversial. And I don't want to weigh in on the controversial parts. But what I do want to say is one thing I took away from her talk is that we often get this question of why do so many women carry water for so-called gender identity when it is obviously so against the interests of women as a sex class. And I understand the question, and it's true. So many women do carry water of all races for the movement to oppress women. And one answer to that is that there's just nothing unusual about women participating in our own oppression, which is what is so wonderful about finding radical feminist analysis. But another answer to the question, and very relatedly, is the women who carry water for so-called gender identity, the women who say that so-called trans women are the most marginalized and the most oppressed, is that those women simply lack a radical feminist analysis of sex and gender. They simply lack a class-based analysis of how women are oppressed on the basis of our sex. And so that is somewhat depressing, obviously, if you're a radical feminist, which we all are, but it's also somewhat encouraging to me, at least, because that just means that there's an easy answer to the question. Even if the answer is not easily implemented, the answer to the question is we just need more radical feminist analysis. We need more radical feminist analysis of women and girls as a sex class, which includes all women and girls, regardless of nationality, regardless of race, regardless of religion. That can help a lot, I think.
Thank you so much. Aja.
I think in my opinion, it's because racism has always been incredibly prominent. It's a lot more, it's visible. It's really in your face. It's one of the first things people, see or recognize or acknowledge when they meet someone. And also the United States of America in particular has never adequately addressed its racist history. When your entire economic system is based on oppressing one race of people, and we still see so many remnants of that with the prison industrial complex, as Dr. Vierling mentioned, with the foster care system. And so it's a way to distract from really unraveling the way it continues to show up in our everyday society, not just in social interactions, but in financial institutions, in colleges and universities, just the sort of simple things. And it's easier to say, hey, instead, look over here and see what's going on. And all you need to do to be a good ally or to help save these poor, helpless people is use their preferred names and pronouns. is to pretend that they're whatever they say they are. And we sign this law and it's like, wait a minute, we look elsewhere and it's taken decades to accomplish real progress,
Right.
if not centuries. And
Mhm.
all of a sudden, ding, 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 ding.
Right.
The world has to pretend that a man is a woman.
Thank you. Lauren.
So I think to be fair, every civil rights movement since the Black Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s has modeled itself on that movement, because that movement had so much success in changing both law and culture. The women's liberation movement of the 1970s borrowed heavily, since its creators included many refugees from the sexism of the overlapping Black civil rights and anti-war movements. Lesbian and gay liberation also attempted to ride the coattails of the successful Black civil rights movement, arguably to the detriment of gay rights, because sexual orientation is not at all a perfect analogy with race. I mean, that's how lesbians got stuck with the dubious born that way dogma, for instance. The civil rights of lesbians shouldn't hinge on lesbianism's questionable innateness and immutability. But the trans movement relies on every civil rights movement for validation: Black, women, and lesbian, gay. The differences between trans activism and the other three movements are, first, the other three demographics are definable and objectively verifiable, whereas trans is not. And second, the other three movements had grassroots origins, whereas trans is completely top-down. This is because it's not a civil rights movement at all, but an industry supported globally by huge corporations and governments. So, of course, it's top-down.
Mhm. Thank you so much. Dr. Suzanne.
I was going to really back up and reiterate what Lauren said. You know, Black, quote unquote, Black is the default for oppression. It's almost equivalent term. So everybody, you know, even in school, I used to have to tell some professors, you know, you got to lighten up on comparing every horrible thing with being Black. It's like a, you know, I know the woke people are tired of hearing these terms, but it's a microaggression, you know, to sit in class and you could be talking about this subject over here, and then the professor will go, well, you know, it's like being Black. And you're like, oh, can you just teach? Do you have to drag me or us or the three of us in this class of 100 into, you know, your description of this other horrible thing that you're talking about? So that's what's happened. And again, we have to remember, this started with a huge comparison to Black men who identified as a woman. So it was able to charge up, especially with the whole Black Lives Matter and George Floyd and everything from civil rights and all the lynching. They compared it to lynching. You have to remember that. And it soaked the United States and also Europe. I thought I saw a Black Lives Matter march in Iceland on Twitter. I said, Iceland ain't got but 2 Black people up there. How are we doing a whole march? So, you know, it really tied it together. And women, look at all of us. We didn't know each other. Like, we met back in 2015, 2016, 2017. We've known each other for a while now. And everyone knew instinctively that what was happening was discrimination. We just didn't have the language for it. So as usual, everybody goes, well, it's like being Black, you know? So.
Thank you so much. Irene.
So many thoughts from what everyone has said. I sort of lost sight of the question, but I think like not, go ahead.
I was going to say, why do you think Black women and white women are so susceptible to falling for gender identity ideology and supporting the movement?
Yeah. I think what someone was saying about their parents trying really hard to be progressive in response to their parents' racism, I think that's often a driving force of like, we have to almost overcorrect, or we have to like be better than our parents. And that's like a noble aim, but sometimes it can lose sight of like how it can lose sight of any kind of class-based analysis, whether about race or sex or something else. And I think like oppression is almost being made, like especially with like under 8, well, I guess young people, Gen Z, oppressions are like a cool thing. Like you have to have some kind of marginalized identity to be sort of valid. I think something that I wanted to bring up is the term intersectionality and how it's kind of been messed up so thoroughly. And in its original form, Kimberly Crenshaw is the academic who coined the term, and it really it has value in bringing together the sum total of different race and sex as 2 different overlapping forms of oppression that add up to more than the sum of their parts. But now it's sort of like it's been co-opted so thoroughly that any sort of oppression can kind of get thrown together, whether it's real or made up. And it doesn't like now it's hard to talk about it with integrity because it has lost its meaning.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Irene. And I just wanted to mention very, very quickly, with Black women, I find that they tend to use this trigger of how we were historically shut out of femininity and beauty standards and using and tying it into that to guilt us into supporting them. And as far as white women are concerned, again, I'm not a white woman, so white women panelists, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. It seems to me that there's a segment of white women that are so afraid of being labeled a bigot or a racist. Not all white women, but some, like to the point where they will just embrace, that's why they're embracing this ideology, because, if I don't, help trans people, then, maybe they're right. Maybe I'm a racist. And it kind of makes me wonder if that's really what's driving, some white women to supporting that movement. That's just my point of view, I guess. Wow, we have a lot of questions. So some of you kind of touched on this, but does anybody, for our last question, want to talk about, any more thoughts on what white women and Black women or all women can do to, just fight against and win against this ridiculous for its teaming of Black civil rights racism and transgender ideology? I'll let you jump in. Lauren? Yes.
Yeah, I think about Audre Lorde, who was female, Black, lesbian, mother, socialist, and more. And she wrote the following, and it resonates with me. I am defined as other in every group I'm part of. Yet without community, there is no liberation. Divide and conquer in our world must become define and empower. So Lorde described herself both as part of a continuum of women and a concert of voices within herself. She's saying that women need to see differences among women not as something merely to be tolerated, but as a source of women's unified power to change society. Lorde argues that women feel pressure to conform to their oneness before recognizing the existing separation among them due to their manyness. Right? She stresses that this behavior is exactly what explains feminists' inability to forge the kind of alliances necessary to create a better world. In 2025, women yearn for community. What I notice currently is a cultural tendency for women to agree prematurely before even acknowledging differences, let alone examining differences, as though it would be too risky to do any of that. It feels as though any differences might get in the way of creating connections and community, because all differences can feel like a conflict or even an attack. And we're not at all sure of our abilities to resolve conflict. We can get better at that. WDI USA, I think, has done an admirable job of facilitating the examination of differences among TERFs. by supporting and promoting the various caucuses, the Black Women's Caucus, the Lesbian Caucus, and the Desisted and Detransitioned Women's Caucus. These caucuses provide spaces for women belonging to these demographics to meet separately and focus exclusively on sharing experiences and observations and forming perspectives and theories based on each demographic. And then once a particular perspective has been formulated, and sorry, I just lost my place.
It's okay.
Once a particular perspective has been formulated in the separate space, each caucus can bring its perspective to WDI USA as a whole, in that way broadening and deepening everyone's understanding of women's cultural and political conditions.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Aja, is there anything you would like to add how Black women and white women can work together to defeat this forced teaming?
Yes, I think really talking to each other. I think there's something to be said with how, divisive politics have gotten, and we haven't really focused on, okay, well, let's ignore all this, blah, 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 and what do we actually want, and how can we get this done? And I think, having more conversations and then set goals and get to work on them. And oh my gosh. And yet know the history, learn each other's history, learn what's going on, stay small. We can look at some of the big issues, but staying small, staying community, and just know that, people use comparison to steal joy.
Yes.
That is the thief of joy. I can't remember who said that, but comparison is thief of joy. Let's focus on the goals and the actions.
Thank you so much. Irene, did you want to add anything about Black women and white women working together to dispel this?
Not really, just what was in my original comments. I think we're often kind of afraid to speak about our experience because we're afraid it might be divisive, and we need to look for overlapping interests.
Kara or Suzanne, anything to add about Black women and white women working together?
Well, on the topic you raised, Lorraine, about white women being afraid of being labeled racist, absolutely. That's my childhood friend, right? My childhood friend was absolutely, unquestionably raised by white, anti-Black, racist parents. And she did a lot of work on herself, and she looked at her own attitudes about race. And then when she said she cares about female-only bathrooms and her teenage daughters told her she was being racist, she was legitimately confused by that. And she had to look at herself and be like, am I being racist here? And so that's definitely a major challenge. And then just generally on the movement, I just want us to call out the racism of their side more, right? Like, need to call out the racism when they say that white
Black women to men.
Compare Black women to men, or when they say that people of the global South didn't know what sex was until you told them.
Yeah.
What? Like, what? That is possibly the most racist argument they've ever come up with. And we shouldn't shy away from calling.
Absolutely.
I just want to just say real quick, there is a lot of history between that documents the Black woman and white woman's relationship that is inaccurate. It's actually wrong.
Wow.
And it's slanted to make it seem as if like white women went out of their way to exclude Black women, and went out of their way and lied about this and lied about rape and lied about that. Believe it or not, there's much more information out there, and we've gotten biased information. So that's part of the reason why white women are like zip, and Black women are like, you have to do that. We get kind of fussy, but there's more truth out there about Susan B. Anthony. There's more truth out there about Ida B. Wells. And there's more truth out there about the relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt and Black women. And people love to say, oh, white women excluded Black women
Mm-hmm.
back in the day. Well, guess what? All women excluded each other.
Yep.
Black women excluded white women from their meetings. Puerto
Mhm.
Rican women excluded Native American women from their meetings. Native American women excluded white women. Mexican women excluded Black women. I mean, women were
Mhm.
compartmentalized in their little spaces. So
Mhm.
those types of like power dynamic exaggerations and saying things that are half truths or
Mhm.
pieces of omission that could really, in my opinion, make a difference. And what I've loved about what we've done so far is we've tried our best to come together and just focus on the task at hand, because it's a
Right.
lot, because it moved a law every day coming out, to hurt us. We don't, we kind of, I thought,
Right.
have done a good job coming together. So anyway.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you all very much for that. So now we will go to our audience question. It looks like Kristen Z is here. Hello, Kristen. This is a very interesting question, because I spoke a little bit about this, how sometimes even the other side might, kind of team up Blackness with transgender ideology. But this is an interesting question from Kristen. How do we address radical feminists using this rhetoric similarly? Comparisons like transgenderism to blackface, never brown face or yellow face, or white colored segregation framed only in black and white terms, reinforcing a pattern that singularly others Black people to make a point. Fair question. Does anybody want to respond to that? Yes, Suzanne.
I saw that, Kristen. I love that question. Blackface is the trigger, right? Because it happened in America with, the blackface entertainers that literally have been on the scene since the 1700s. And this is how you see how Black women are excluded in this comparison. This is really a comparison between white men in blackface and white men in women face. Okay, people forget that Martin Lawrence did black woman face. We forget that Flip Wilson back in the 70s did Black woman face. Eddie Murphy has horrifically done Black woman face. We have Tyler Perry
Tyler
has
Perry.
done Black woman face. But when people bring up blackface, they're talking about men.
Mm-hmm.
So you have Al Jolson or Jim Crow. I mean, the actual Jim Crow character. Those were white men mocking Black men, and the trans are white men mocking women or mocking white women, or if it's a Black drag queen, then they're mocking Black women. So do you see what I'm saying?
Yes,
People
yes.
don't know the minstrel history. That's the minstrel shows. They don't know the minstreling of Black women. So even in this example that is repeated over and over and over, people don't realize that Black women went through a horrific minstrel period from the 70s, Flip Wilson's show, all the way through, I think, 90s, early 2000s, with all these Black actors who mocked Black women in blackface, Black woman.
Wow.
So I just wanted to just throw that in the mix. We're really, when they bring up this black face thing, they're really talking about men and men.
Wow. I never even thought about it like that. I always thought of blackface, Black people, but really most of it seems to be man versus man. I never thought about that. Thank you for your, you, as usual, your enlightenment, Dr. Vierling. Okay. This was, I am so glad that we did this webinar. I learned a lot, and I hope that you all in the audience learned a lot. And I thank you all for being on this panel. And let's continue to fight, because the fight is not over. They are in it for the long haul. We should be too. And if you are so inclined to sign our declaration, please click on the link below and sign away. Thank you all so much for joining us, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Okay.